So two people come out of a symphony orchestra concert. The exact same concert on the exact same day, and one person was transported by the music, was caught up in the beauty of the composition and in the interpretation of the orchestra director and in the musician's talent and skill in playing the piece. The other person was unmoved, came out and was no different than when he had gone in. Two students in the same English class sit through a unit on Shakespeare. And one student, after hearing the language and the movement within the plays that were part of that unit, discovered a new insight into universal human truths. The other student had a painful exercise in endurance. There he is, right there. In the past 2 weeks of gospel passages, we heard Jesus asleep in a boat, roused by his disciples, calming a storm after his disciples wake him in a panic. Then last week we hear of Jesus being a conduit through which God's healing comes to a woman who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for many, many years. And then he goes and raises Jairus' daughter. And yet this week, in contrast, he comes home, and the narrative said he was powerless to do any deeds of power except for curing a few sick people. So what's the difference in the concert goers, in the Shakespeare students, and in the gospel narratives that we have now heard 3 weeks in a row, between experiencing something transformative and powerful and not experiencing anything at all? Oftentimes our experiences in life are not so much conditioned by what comes to us externally, but by what is happening to us internally at the time in which we have the encounter. Our experiences are conditioned, our movement is determined by our receptivity. That is a big part of what's going on in this morning's gospel passage, is the receptivity of those in his hometown. And the language that we heard about the questioning by those who received Jesus' teaching in the synagogue, the word that's used in the English translation is they were astounded. And oftentimes our association with that word is that this is something amazing, kind of positive and impressive. But the way that they were astounded was of a different vein. The questions that they are asking about, is this not the carpenter? Is saying, we know this guy, and he's putting on pretenses. One insight into the reason why it said they took offense at him is that he was of the working class. So Jesus, as a carpenter, would not have been expected to be saying the kind of things that he was in his teaching. That was for the learned class. And if you are of one class and you act like you're of another class, that can rub people the wrong way, especially if it seems to them to be pretentious. So when they say, where did he get such wisdom? It's not a compliment. It's actually a critique that he's putting on airs and acting like he knows a whole bunch of stuff that carpenters don't know. That's not their training. It's not their education. And he is stepping outside of the bounds in which they expect him to be in. And that is the crux of the disconnect in this gospel passage. It is not Jesus' inability to do the same kinds of things in his hometown that he did in the previous passages, healings and works of authority over the natural world. It is instead their receptivity or lack thereof that has blocked them from being able to experience what Jesus has offered in other times and in other places. So that's the first half of what we have heard, is that he has this, what I'm sure was a very frustrating experience of coming home and wanting to share of what God had given him with those who he was closest to, with his friends whom he'd grown up with his family members, and yet even his family members, as is just slightly alluded to in this passage and in other gospel passages is more explicit, were kind of mystified by what he was doing. We're a little bit uneasy about the kind of reputation that he was getting that seemed to be too big for his britches. So he has this experience of being frustrated, and immediately afterwards, it's very illustrative that he sends out his disciples to multiply the blessing that he has worked up until that point on his own. And so out of his discouragement or his frustration, he is not going away to sulk. He doesn't turn bitter and say, well, if they don't want what I've got to bring them, then curses on them. He instead empowers those who are his followers and sends them out to bring the power of proclamation of good news, the power of healing and restoration to other people in other places. And he gives them some instructions that center around helping them to keep focused on their mission. The idea about not bringing a whole lot of things in preparation is about trusting in God's provision through the hospitality of others who they will meet. So don't make a whole lot of arrangements for contingency plans about how you're going to be sheltered and how you're going to be clothed, because you are bringers of the presence of God, and others will recognize that that is what comes with you, and their responsiveness will provide for your needs. And so they are encouraged to be about simplicity and about a singularity of focus in the power that they have been given through Jesus to bring to other people. But he also offers them a word of guidance should they encounter places in which they are not welcomed. And this is probably one of the more famous lines in the Gospels that many people are familiar with about if you are not received, then leave that place and shake off the dust of your feet as a condemnation against them. And that sounds kind of vindictive. It sounds kind of, well, curses on you then. What I think is coming through even more than that sentiment is that Jesus is encouraging them to take the time and the energy that they have and to use it for the greatest effect. And so he is saying, don't fight against resistance that you receive. And this is mirrored by what just happened to him in his hometown. The gospel does not recount that he gets in an argument with anybody and says, guys, you're missing it. Just open your eyes. Just understand what's going on, what I brought into your midst. He treats those who have not recognized what he has to bring as adults, as people who have given the free will choice to receive or not to receive. And so he encourages his followers in the same way. Leave that place if it's not working, if you are not received, and go on to another place. There are other people who are waiting to hear what God is wanting to do among us at this time. And so it is a message of good use, wise stewardship of time and energy on their journeys. So the common theme that we are hearing in these two halves of this gospel is about receptivity. And I want to invite you to think about your own receptivity towards God meeting you in your life on a day-to-day basis. and invite you to reflect on the question of how much God has to break in sometimes or break through our own preoccupations in order to have us understand, to recognize that God is at work in our lives and in the world about us. And that oftentimes, just like the concert goer, just like the Shakespeare student, and just like recipients of Jesus' acts of power in the Gospels, our own openness to God's presence plays a huge role in determining how much we experience the reality of God in our lives. How often are we preparing ourselves at the beginning of the day for what God has to show us? Or how often does God have to knock us upside the head and go, I've been trying to get your attention for a month now. You with me? You with me? Do I got it? And so sometimes very simple acts of preparation can reap enormous positive consequences of our being able to bask in the glory of God's presence. Prayers at the beginning of the day. God, help to show me what you have in store for me this day, and lead me in my actions and my words as I move through the commitments and the free time of what is to come. Some of you have for a number of years been in the habit of, when you arrive on Sunday morning, of taking some time in quiet reflection, of preparing yourself for the worship to come and calming the voices of distraction or the preoccupations that might be coming with you, and asking those to take a rest for an hour or so, so that you can be fully present in the company of God. It is those kinds of openings that we can do, not complicated, not with deeply complex theological language, but more rotations, adjustments of our receptivity that allow God to do what God is wanting to do in our lives. Many, many years ago, I was having a conversation with a colleague of mine who was the head of an Episcopal school that I was serving as the chaplain of. And we weren't talking about school or about chapel or kids or anything. Had a good relationship with him and was talking about how over the last week or so, I had been getting in a lot of snippy conversations with my wife at the end of the day. And I was just kind of frustrated and cranky about it. And he said, so how do you get ready to go home? I had no idea what he was talking about. It seemed to be a question out of left field. And he said, well, what are you like when you arrive home and the first, thing that you say to each other? Still totally over my head. And he had to draw out an awareness of me that what I was doing at the end of the day was arriving at home with things still left unresolved from my day. And my crankiness with my wife had nothing to do with her. It actually had to do with what was going on with me at church and school that week. And I was taking it home. And I wasn't stopping and preparing myself to be home and to be open and receptive to being with my family. And with that insight, the next day on my 7-minute drive home, it didn't take very long, I said, all right, I'm done. That stayed there. I'll come back to it tomorrow morning. I'm going to be home now. And guess what happened? We had a great night that night. And it was all about being open, being receptive, being present with who I was with in that moment. There is a lesson that I have carried with me throughout the rest of my life from that wisdom that was given to me by my friend about my relationship with God. And that when I stop and when I allow and invite God to be fully present with me in the things of my life, oftentimes, there He is. There God is, because I have allowed myself to see and to hear. Jesus had many encounters such as this with those for whom the timing was right and those for whom there were distractions and preoccupations that prevented them from receiving the gifts that he had to bring. But the good news is that we are the people of a God of grace, and that God doesn't give us just one singular opportunity in order to be touched and to be blessed. And so may the wisdom of these gospel passages of these last few weeks and the experiences of those who encountered Christ in their lives face to face be a gift to us as we go out from this place in the rest of our Sunday and in the week to come, to be as open and receptive as we possibly can to receiving all that God has in store for us in our lives in the week to come. Amen.